Hey guys, what's going on, and welcome back to the channel. Hope everybody's having a good day today. And today I'm going to do a little bit of a discussion, have a little seminar, and give some tips on a few. Actually, I've gotten this reoccurring question a lot. Actually, it was a two-part question from some of the subscribers. One is, how do I fish jigs, and when do you know when to fish a jig over soft plastic? And I think a lot of people have got, that get into the sport a little bit, maybe have a little bit of an intimidation factor when it comes to jigs if they've learned how to fish worms. And I'm going to give you guys all the juice on it today and sort of give you some tips to sort of simplify, maybe make sense of it a little bit more. But just real quick before we get started here, guys, just wanted to encourage everybody, invite everybody to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I really appreciate that. If you could hit that subscribe button, free and easy. You can unsubscribe if I say something you don't like, which happens quite a bit. Occasionally I lose subscribers over different videos I do, because there's a lot of sensitive people out there that get offended by that. But anyway, I appreciate if you could subscribe. And also, another favor I'd like to ask for everybody, if you guys could share the videos I do with some of your friends that don't subscribe and maybe get them to come on board. That'd be much appreciated, and it's a great way to help the channel out if you like what I'm doing here. Okay, let's talk about these jigs a little bit. I think, in fact, the last couple people I've taken out on my instructional on the water lessons, they've had a lot of questions about jigs because they just hadn't had a chance to fish them much. And I think there's two different elements that we need to address with jigs. Number one is, when is the best time to use them? And number two, what is the difference between using a jig or like a Texas rig soft plastic specifically, in those two things. So we'll get into both a little bit. First of all, let's talk about let me give you guys just a foundational jig overview. And I'm going to do a lot of stuff on jigs. Jigs are going to be sort of a reoccurring theme of the channel here, because there's so much to talk about. You've got so many different types of jigs and situations that they work in that it would literally take me hours. This video would last 3 hours if I was talking about jigs specifically and trying to cover everything. But as a good foundational thing to get you guys started, I just want to get some solid points down here. First of all, jigs don't have a season. They work 12 months out of the year under a variety of conditions. And the thing about it is you just sort of have to know when to use a jig under what situation and what type of jig to use for those situations. So I'll just give you guys a random example with that. Everybody, 50 years ago, they thought that in the winter time of year, jigs were what you needed to fish, like the old hair jigs, like a black hair jig, because they thought bass were lethargic, harder to catch in the winter time. And most people use the old jig and eel. A lot of you guys that watch the channel probably don't even know what a jig and eel is, but it was basically just a hair jig with a pork eel on the back of it, old school as you can get. And people fish that in the wintertime. And to be honest with you guys, out of the 4 seasons of the year, the wintertime is the least amount of time I fish a jig. And if I do fish a jig in the wintertime, it's usually some type of a finesse jig. But basically, you have the categories of jigs we're talking about, and the bite we're talking about with that. I want to basically relegate it to 3. Your casting or your casting and pitching type jigs, your football head jigs, and your finesse jigs. And when I'm talking about cast and pitching jigs, that covers a wide range. That covers, jigs that you flip heavy cover with, jigs that you just cast into deep water and say work down ledges. And then the finesse jigs are exactly what they say. They're just a diminutive, smaller size jig with smaller trailers on it. And then the football head jigs are specifically designed most of the time for deeper water, offshore fishing. The head thing, every time guys I get a video, I got some dude out with a loud truck, but the football head jig is just what it says. The head on the jig looks just like a football head. So those are the 3 different categories. Now, for the most part, the general rule of thumb, I like to use some type of a pitching jig, flipping jig, or finesse jig in the springtime of the year, the summertime of the year, and the fall time of the year. For example, in early springtime of the year, I love to fish, the pitching and flipping jigs or the casting jigs around, channel banks, bluff banks, and the finesse jigs both. Finesse jigs are great on any type of bluffy type bank in a variety of different water clarities. And then of course, if you have any flooded cover, you know, the pitching and flipping jig works real good. To me, the football head jig comes into play after the spawn. I mean, you can catch fish, you can catch good ones on it even in the pre-spawn, and a lot of guys do in certain situations. But for me, I use the football head jig mainly, you know, like June, July, and August. That's sort of the meat of the season for me with the football head jig. And then in the fall time of the year, I catch a lot of fish just on the finesse jig, and because, you know, finesse jigs, usually in the fall time of the year, that's the toughest time of year that you can fish, and sometimes the finesse jig gets a lot of bites. So anyway, that's just sort of an overview of jigs. The second part of this is, when do you know when to use a soft plastic over a jig? Now, a lot of this has to do with two different factors. It has to do with like the type of lake that you're fishing, and it has to do with the aggressiveness of the bass. What I am trying to do in every lake that I go to where I think there's going to be a jig bite or some type of a pitching and flipping soft plastic bite, I'm always trying to get them to hit the jig first, because the jig, finesse jig, football head, regular pitching and flipping jig, you simply get better quality fish on it. What you have with jig fishing for the most part is you will average anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 pound larger. Say, for example, if you catch 100 fish on a jig and 100 fish on a soft plastic creature bait, overall, those 100 bass on the jig are gonna weigh anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 pound more than they would on the creature bait, like the beaver, for the most part. So I'm always trying to get them to hit the jig, because I know it'll produce bigger fish. And I also know when I'm fishing a jig, I'm probably not gonna get as many bites, because soft plastic baits, they get more bites for a couple different reasons. You have a wider color variation, you have a wider profile selection, and you can, you know, upsize or downsize real easily to match exactly what the bass want. And you can do that a little bit on jigs, but not quite as much as soft plastics. So that's the first thing in my mind when I'm trying to determine which to use. I usually always start out with the jig. If they're biting a jig, I stay with the jig. If they're not biting a jig, then that's when I make the decision to go with a soft plastic. And the soft plastic, again, it can be, there's so many different soft plastics out there. It just is totally dependent upon the lake that you're fishing. If I'm fishing, you know, a lake that's a tough fish in clear water, it's got a lot of spotted and smallmouth bass, I may be, you know, throwing a shaky head, like a trick worm, something like that, a Ned rig, tube, something like that. If I'm on a lake that's got more cover, a little bit heavier cover, I may be going with like a brush hog or some type of a Z-hog, Z-craw, some type of a creature bait, you know, simply to, you know, try to get some more bites on it. But for me, if I'm in like some type of a hardcore fishing situation where they're biting jigs and soft plastic both a little bit, I always have both of them rigged up. And normally, almost without fail, I'll start out, say, early in my day or early in the tournament fishing a jig. And as the day goes on, or as the week goes on, they slowly get off the jig a little bit. And what usually I have to do, I have to supplement the bite by going to a soft plastic. And that allows me to maximize the area that I'm fishing. That's one of the big keys in fishing, guys, is once you have established and found an area that's got a good concentration of fish, you maximize that area by a lot of different ways. You maximize it by your bait selection, your bait colors, your bait profiles, your casting angles, boat positioning, a lot of different stuff goes with it. But specifically, you know, I never start out with the soft plastic. Most every single time I'll start out with the jig, and then I'll only get away from the jig if the fishing is not as good as what I think it should be, and that's when I go to the soft plastic. Another time I'll use it if I'm fishing a lake that I know has a lot of heavy fishing pressure. Any time I'm in that situation, I'll rely a little bit more heavily on the soft plastic, because again, soft plastics, the variety of colors and profiles and the salt content and all that, you simply just get more bites on them. So under that situation, I may rely a little bit more heavily on it than I will the jigs. But as far as the bite, I think one of the things that I hear over and over from guys that ask me questions about jigs is they say they don't know how to fish them, really. Guys, if you can fish a Texas rig worm, if you can fish a Texas rig beaver or a creature bait, you can fish a jig. There's no difference. I work the bait the same way. If I'm fishing a brush hog or a Z-hog or a beaver style bait, I fish it the same way that I do as if I'm pitching and flipping a 1/2 ounce jig. My rod motions are the same. I manipulate the lure the same. The bite pretty much feels the same. The only thing that will change the feel of a bite is the weight of either your jig head or your sinker, because the heavier the sinker, a lot of times that changes the bite versus, you know, if you have a light sinker on there. So anyway, that's just a real broad foundation. I know we've had some questions on that. Hope that shed some light on some questions you have. Feel free to shoot me questions, guys. If you guys got questions, you know, drop a question in the comment here. And like I said, I'll be breaking this down, this whole jig soft plastic deal from now on, moving forward. It'll just be a regular part of the channel, you know, specifically dealing with little subtleties of each particular bait and technique. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. Much appreciated. Again, hit that subscribe button, much appreciated. Probably at the end of next week, when we get close to hitting 40,000 subscribers, we got a big giveaway coming up. Cases of Bridgeford beef jerky, big spools of Seagar fishing line, silverback sunglasses we're going to be giving away to the winners. All you have to do is be subscribed to the channel to be eligible. So talk to you later. See you.